our Gorlick, our Gwenolan, Lander Philog, Lander Chymede, our Hosen, our Porth. All those dying Welsh villages. I'd get so tense before a performance. Do you know what I used to do? As we drove along those narrow, winding roads, I'd recite the names to myself just for the mesmerism, the sedation of the incantation. Kinloch Burvey, Inverburvey, Inverdrui, Invergordon, Badacrew, Kinloch Crew, Ballantrae, Inverkything, Carder, Kirkconnell, Pladdie, Kirkkinner. Welsh, Scottish, over the years they became indistinguishable. The kirks or meeting houses or schools, all identical, all derelict. Maybe in a corner a withered sheaf of wheat from a harvest Thanksgiving of years ago, or a fragment of a Christmas decoration across a window, relics of abandoned rituals. Because the people we moved among, were beyond that kind of celebration. Hardly ever cities or towns because the halls were far too dear for us. Seldom England because Teddy and Gracie were English, and they believed, God help them, that the Celtic temperament was more receptive to us, and never Ireland because of me. I beg your pardon. The fantastic Francis Hardy faith healer, one night only. The man on the tatty banner. When we started out, years and years ago, we used to have Francis Hardy, seventh son of a seventh son, across the top. But it made the poster too expensive, and Teddy persuaded me to settle for the modest fantastic. It was a favorite word of his, and maybe in this case, he employed it with accuracy. As for the seventh son, that was a lie. I was in fact the only child of elderly parents, Jack and Mary Hardy, born in the village of Kilmeedy, in County Limerick, where my father was sergeant of the guards, but that's another story. The initials were convenient, weren't they? F.H., faith healer. Or if you were a believer in fate, you might say my life was determined the day I was christened. Perhaps if my name had been Charles Potter, I would have been Cardinal Primate, or Patsy Muldoon, the fantastic Prime Minister. No, I don't mock those things, by no means. I'm not respectful, but I don't mock. Faith healing. A craft without an apprenticeship, a ministry without responsibility, a vocation without a ministry. How did I get involved? As a young man, I chanced to flirt with it, and it possessed me. No, that's rhetoric, no. Let's say I did it because I could do it. That's accurate enough. And occasionally it worked. Occasionally it did work. Oh, yes. And when it did, when I stood before a man and placed my hands on him and watched him become whole in my presence, those were nights of exaltation. No, not that I was doing good, giving relief, spreading joy. Good God, no. Nothing at all to do with that. But because the questions that undermined my life then became meaningless. Because I knew that for those few hours I had become whole in myself. And perfect in myself. And in a manner of speaking, an aristocrat. If the term doesn't offend you, Pip. But the question is, they began modestly enough with the pompous struttings of a young man. Am I endowed with a unique and awesome gift? My God, yes, I'm afraid so. And I suppose the other extreme was, am I a con man? Which of course was nonsense, I think. And between those absurd exaggerations, the possibilities were legion. Was it all chance, or skill, or illusion, or delusion? Precisely what power did I possess? Could I summon it? When and how was I its servant? Did it reside in my ability to invest someone with faith in me, or did I invoke from him a healing faith in himself? Could my healing be effected without faith? But faith in what? In me. In the possibility. Faith in faith. And is the power diminishing? You're beginning to masquerade, aren't you? You're becoming a husk, aren't you? And so it went on and on and on. Silly, wasn't it? Considering that 9 times out of 10, nothing at all happened. But they persisted right to the end, those nagging, tormenting, maddening questions that rotted my life. When I refused to confront them, they ambushed me. And when they threatened to submerge me, I silenced them with whiskey. I was efficient for a while. It got me through the job, night after night. And when nothing happened, When something did happen, it helped me to accept that. But I can tell you this. There was one thing I did know, one thing I always knew right from the beginning. I always knew, drunk or sober, I always knew when nothing was going to happen. Teddy. Yes, let me tell you about Teddy, my manager. Cockney, buoyant, cheerful, tiny, nimble feet, dressed in cord jacket, bow tie, greasy velour hat. I never knew much about his background except that he had been born into show business. And I never understood why he stayed with me because we barely scraped a living. But he had a devotion to me. And I think he had a vague sense of being associated with something spiritual, and that gave him satisfaction. If you met him in a bar, he'd hold you with those brown eyes of his. I've handled some of the most sensational properties in my day, dear Art, believe me, but I've thrown him up all for Mr. Hardy here, because he's just the most fantastic thing you've ever seen. And listening to him, I'd almost forgot what indeed he had given up to tour with us. A Miss Mulatto and her 3 pigeons, and a languid whippet called Rob Roy, who took sounds from a set of bagpipes. Humbling precedents, if I were given to pride. And he believed all along, right up to the end, that somewhere, one day, something fantastic was going to happen to us. Believe me, dear Art, perhaps when we have had barely enough petrol to take us to the next village, believe me, we are on the point of making a killing. He was a romantic man, and when he talked about this killing, I had a fairy tale image of us being summoned to some royal bedroom, and learned doctors being pushed aside, and I'd raise the sleeping princess to life, and we'd be wined and dined for 7 days and 7 nights, and sent on our way with bags of sovereigns. But he was a man of many disguises. Perhaps he wasn't romantic. Perhaps he knew that's what I'd think. Perhaps he was much more perceptive man than I knew. And there was Grace, my mistress, a Yorkshire woman, controlled, correct, methodical, orderly, who fed me, washed and ironed me, nursed me, humored me, saved me, I'm sure, from drinking myself to death, would have attempted to reform me because that was her nature, but didn't because her instincts were wiser than her impulses. Grace Doddsmith from Scarborough, or was it Knaresborough? I don't remember, they all sound so alike it doesn't matter. She never asked for marriage, and for all her tidiness, I don't think she wanted marriage. Her loyalty was adequate for her. And it was never a heady relationship, not even in the early days, but it lasted. A surviving relationship. And yet as we grew older together, I thought it wouldn't. Because that very virtue of hers, that mulish, unquestioning, indefatigable loyalty, settled on us like a heavy dust. Nothing I did, neither my bitterness, nor my deliberate neglect, nor my blatant unfaithfulness could disturb it. We'd arrive in the van, usually in the early morning, pin up the poster, arrange the chairs and benches, place a table inside the door for collection, maybe sweep the place out. Gracie'd make tea on the Primus stove. Teddy try out his amplifying system. I would fortify myself with some drink. Then we'd wait, and wait, and as soon as darkness fell, a few would begin to sidle in. Penrith, Pencarder, Dunvegan, Dunblane, Ben Lars, Ben Rhines, Kirkliston, Benane. Teddy and his amplifying system. I fought with him about it a dozen times and finally gave in to him. Our row was over when he called, was over what he called atmospheric background music. When the people would have gathered, Teddy would ask them. He held the microphone up to his lips and assumed a special reverential tone. He'd ask them to stay in their seats while I moved among them. Everybody be attended to, dear Art. Relax, take it easy, and when Mr. Audie gets to you, no need to tell him what's bothering you. Mr. Audie knows. Just trust him. Put yourself in his hands, and God bless you all. And now, dear Art, Mr. Audie Fayfielder. At which point I would emerge, and at the same moment Teddy put on his record. And as I moved from seat to seat among the crippled and the blind, and the disfigured and the deaf and the barren, the voice and the style of the 30s crooned Jerome Kern's song. Lovely, never, never change. Keep that breathless charm. Won't you please arrange it, 'cause I love you just the way you look tonight. Yes. We were always balanced somewhere between the absurd and the momentous. And the people who came, is there to say about them? They're a despairing people. That they came to me, a mountebank, was a measure of their despair. They seldom spoke, sometimes didn't even raise their eyes. They just sat there, very still, assuming that I divined their complaints, abject, abased, tight, longing to open themselves, and at the same time, fearfully hurting the anguish they contained against disturbance, and they hated me. Oh yes, they hated me. Because by coming to me, they exposed, publicly acknowledged their desperation. And even though they told themselves they were here because of the remote possibility of a cure, they knew in their hearts they had come not to be cured, but for confirmation that they were incurable. Not in hope, but for the elimination of hope. For the removal of that final impossible chance. That's why they came. To seal their anguish for the content of a finality. And they knew what I knew. And so they defied me to endow them with hopelessness. But I couldn't do even that for them, and they knew I couldn't. A peculiar situation, wasn't it? No, not peculiar, eerie. Because occasionally, just occasionally, the miracle would happen. And then, panic. Their ripping apart, the explosion of their careful calculations, the sudden flooding of dreadful, hopeless hope. I often thought it would have been a kindness to them not to go near them. And there was another thing about them. When Teddy was introducing me, I would look at them, and sometimes I got a strange sense that they weren't there on their own behalf at all, but as delegates, legati, chosen because of their audacity, and that, outside, poised, mute. Waiting in the half-light were hundreds of people who held their breath while we were in the locality. And I sometimes got the impression, too, that if we hadn't come to them, they would have sought us out. We were in the north of Scotland when I got word that my mother had had a heart attack. In a village called Kinlochbervie in Sutherland, about as far north as you can go in Scotland. A picturesque little place, very quiet, very beautiful, looking across to the Isle of Lewis and the Outer Hebrides. Hebrides. And we were enjoying a few days' rest there. Anyhow, when the news came, Teddy drove me down to Glasgow. Gracie wanted to come with me and couldn't understand why I wouldn't take her. But she used her incomprehension as fuel for her loyalty and sent me off with a patient smile. It was my first time home in 20 years. My father had retired and was living in a housing estate outside Dublin. When he opened the door, he didn't recognize me. I had to tell him who I was. Then he shook my hand as if I were an acquaintance and led me up to the bedroom. She was exactly as I remembered her. Illness hadn't ravaged her, sleeping silently. Her skin smooth and girlish, her chin raised as if in expectation. Jesus, I thought. Oh my Jesus, what am I going to do? She looks nice, he said. Yes, I said, she looks great. He cleared his throat. She passed away quietly. You missed her by approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes, as if you were giving evidence. And then he cried. And I felt such overwhelming relief that when he cried, I cried easily with him. 12 years later, I was back in Ireland again, with Teddy and Gracie. Things had been lean for a long time, or as Teddy put it, if we want to eat, we've got to open up a new territory, dear. I've cured them all here. Come on, let's go to the lush pickings of Ireland. And I agreed because I was as heartsick of Wales and Scotland as they were, and the whiskey wasn't as efficient with the questions as it had been. And my father had died in the meantime. And I suppose, because I always knew we would end up there. So on the last day of August, we crossed from Stranraer to Larne and drove through the night to County Donegal. There we got lodgings in a pub, a lounge bar really, outside a village called Ballybeg, not far from Donegal town. There really was no sense of homecoming. I tried to stimulate it, but nothing stirred. Only a few memories, wane, and neutral. One of my father watching me through the bars of the day room window as I left for school. We lived in a rented house across the street. One of playing with handcuffs, slipping my hands in and out through the rings. One of my mother making bread and singing a hymn to herself. Yes, heaven, yes, heaven is the prize. And one of a group of men being shown over the barracks. I think they were inspectors from Dublin. My father saying, "Certainly, gentlemen, by all means, gentlemen, anything you say, gentlemen." Maybe one or two other memories. They evoke nothing. When we came downstairs to the lounge in the pub, we got caught up in the remnants of a wedding party. 4 young men, locals, small farmers, whose friend had just gone off on his honeymoon a few hours earlier. Good suits, white carnations, dark, angular faces, thick fingers, black nails. And for a while they pretended to ignore us. Then Ned, the biggest of them, asked bluntly who we were and what we were. Teddy told him. Dear Art, the most sensational, fantastic. And either at the extravagance of the introduction, or because of an unease, they suddenly exploded with laughter, and we were embraced. We formed a big circle and drank and chatted. Gracie sang Ilky Moore, something like that. Teddy entertained them with tales of our tours, ranging from the outrageous to the maudlin, and ended with his brown eyes moist with tears. Dear Arts, the insights it's given me into tortured humanity. And I told him myself that I was indeed experiencing a homecoming. All irony was suspended. Then suddenly, a man called Donald, who had scarcely spoken up to this, thrust a bent finger in front of my face and challenged, "Straighten that, Mr. Hardy." And the bar went still. I caught the finger between my palms of my hands and held it there and looked into his face. Already he was uneasy. He wanted to withdraw the challenge. He began to stammer how the accident happened, something about a tractor, a gearbox, a faulty setting. And as he spoke, I massaged the finger. When he stopped talking, I opened my hands and released him. The finger was whole. Badralach, Kilmore, Lanfathu, Lanfechel, Kincardy, Kinross, Laucaron, Lugelli. We cruised right through the night. Toast to the landlord who claimed he met my father once, and as the night went on, they were all close friends. Toast to Teddy and Gracie. Toast to my return, to Donald's finger. Toast to the departed groom and his prowess, to the bride and her fertility, to the rich harvest, the corn, the wheat, the barley. Toast to all Septembers and all harvests, and to all things ripe and eager for the reaper. A Dionysian night, a Bacchanalian night, a frenzied, excessive Irish night when ritual was consciously and relentlessly watched. Then, sometime before dawn, McGarvey was remembered. Their greatest, their closest friend McGarvey, who in his time had danced with them, and drunk with them, and built roads with them, and cut turf with them. McGarvey, who ought to have been the best man that day, my God, who else? And who wasn't even at the wedding reception. And as they created him, I saw McGarvey in my mind, saw his strained face and his mauve hands, his burning eyes, crouched in his wheelchair and sick with bitterness. Saw him and knew him before Teddy, in his English innocence, asked why he wasn't there, before Ned told us of the fall from the scaffolding and the paralysis. Saw him and recognized our meeting, an open place, a walled yard, trees, orange skies, warm wind, and knew with that cold certainty that nothing was going to happen. Nothing at all. I stood at the window and watched them set off to fetch McGarvey. 4 of them getting into a battered car, now serious and busy with good deeds. Now being polite to one another, holding open doors. You sit in front. No, you. Then they were all gone.